Hi everyone. I'm going to start with an observation. Most of my subscribers are male. I'm not quite sure why it's developed that way, but that's the way it is. But with that in mind, we've recently had International Men's Day, and the issue of male mental health is often brought up. Now, sometimes this is spoken about as if it's kind of one singular thing, but it's not. People are different. The mental health experience that one guy goes through won't necessarily be the same as someone else. So just because I've been through, for example, clinical depression, doesn't mean it will be exactly the same sort of situation as someone else has been through. That's why it's important to recognize that this is quite a wide reaching subject. But like I've said before, one of the positive things is that I think there has genuinely been more discussion of this in recent years. There has genuinely been less of a stigma, I believe, over the past 10, 15 years. Uh, I mentioned before there's prominent people, Prince William, Prince Harry, Tyson Fury, and there's many others who have have kind of destigmatized this. And I'm not saying them alone, of course. Mental health charities have played a very big role, but it does help when you have a prominent figure speaking out. And so that's a positive thing because whilst there is still sadly some guys who feel there's no way out, and sometimes do take that act of finality. I think everyone knows what I'm referencing with that. Um, there is still a lot of cause for hope because sometimes I think the world could be a bit overwhelming. Let's be honest about it. Because we look at individual pressures, then we look at the exterior of the world. Now, if like me, you are into politics, you're into social issues, you're into what's happening in the world, um, you just can't be selfish by nature. You can't. It's not built into you to just say, well, the hell with the world. It's just I want to go focus on myself. Um, but there is also a basic truth that if you don't look after yourself to begin with, you can't help anyone else. You really can't. So self care is important. Self love is important. Um, I want the overriding theme of this video to be positive, but in order to do that, we also have to be candid about the way things sometimes are. I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way. I mean, today, for example, it's a bleak day. It's a bleak winter day. It's rainy. It's bleak. There's not a lot of good news right now going on in the world, and there's causes I feel strongly about that are not going the way I would like them to go. I feel passionately, for example, about the situation in Ukraine, and that is a very challenging situation right now. And I'm not even Ukrainian, but it depresses me. I can only imagine what my Ukrainian friends, what they're feeling right now. And all I could do as a human being is try and support them as much as I can. I'm not in a position to financially support at the moment, but I try to just let them know, you're not alone. There's people that are sympathetic. There's people that are in solidarity with you. So I try to do that. And there's others out there. I know many great people who are supportive of the Ukrainian community here. Um, that's just one example. There's others. I sometimes find myself getting very worked up and depressed about certain domestic things. Top all of this probably is crime. I feel strongly on that subject. I get depressed when I see heinous crimes, that innocent people targeted by bullies. And that sort of thing does get me down. I'll be honest, it does. And then I start thinking about the subject and I get worked up about the way the justice system is. And I have to really step back a little bit because if I don't, I would absolutely just go crazy. It's sometimes important if you are like me, if you're into these things, just get a little bit of escapism sometimes. It is so very important. That could be anything. It could be a bit of music. It could be some silly YouTube video. It could be anything. I think that is actually extremely important. We talk about dumbing down, but sometimes dumbing down is actually, by which I mean, a bit of escapism. It's helpful actually. Um, but another thing I find very helpful is keeping busy. Now, by keeping busy, I'm not talking about 9 to 5 job. You know, if you've been through unemployment, that is obviously not easy. But just generally being busy, always keeping our minds active. And it doesn't have to be on heavy, in depth subjects, although that could also be helpful because it keeps you focused on something. But just anything, just keeping busy. Just keeping busy. And I think also recognizing what is wasted energy. Now, I'll be honest, I have struggled with anger at times. And you know what? We talk about male mental health. I'm going to say that because I think it's one that is still a bit of a stigma. Because if people hear anger, they assume, violence. They assume it's like lashing out at people. Not necessarily in my case. I think I've got a lot of self control. You know, there's people I strongly disagree with, but I know that I can't just go up and yell at them, or you know, resort to violence. Obviously, I never would, because it's for one thing, it's a criminal offence, but for another, it doesn't really help matters. It may make you feel temporarily better, but it could actually cause more problems. So that self control is an extremely important thing. But I think with something like anger, and I do feel in a position to talk about this because I've experienced it a lot, it is ultimately wasted energy for the most part. Now, I don't say that we should be robots and not feel those human emotions, and anger is a very human emotion. Um, if you see injustice and you feel angry, that is actually, I think, it's representative of a conscience, it's representative of compassion. And some of the great moral leaders in history have also had bouts of real anger. In fact, probably the most prominent example, and I don't want to get too religious here, but there's a famous example of Jesus going into the temple and, turning the tables of the money, then there's in a rage. That wasn't the gentle, meek Jesus that we sometimes hear about. That was an enraged Jesus Christ. Um, but if you don't want to take a religious example, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill had reportedly periods of real anger, real um, rants, let's face it. But those were men who were dealing with enormous, enormous weight on their back, enormous responsibility. I'm sure in his many years in imprisonment, Nelson Mandela had days of rage. Um, Martin Luther King Jr., whilst he's famous as a pacifist, it doesn't mean that he was, kind of meek and passive. I'm sure he was deeply angry about the injustice. So the point I'm making with this is there's a little bit of a misconception about anger that it's always just about violence. Anger can be a powerful thing, but being consumed by anger is not healthy, and I do think it's wasted energy. When you're just fuming about something, you're not really doing anything with it. Sometimes you can find a useful vacuum for anger. Now, sometimes I've made videos coming from a point of anger sounds bad, but something that I feel strongly about. And I would say that's actually productive. That is utilizing that frustration in a positive way because I'm putting it out there. I'm giving people a subject matter to think about. And, when you get more minds thinking alike or more minds thinking on a particular subject, ultimately it's more likely to affect change. Won't happen overnight. I'm not naive. But, how does any change ever happen? By people talking, by people expressing, by people and of course action, but you have to talk about it before there is action. You can't have action without talk, and you can't have talk without action. Actually, both are coupled by one another, I think. Um, but what I find is a very good thing is that no matter what unpleasant news there is, no matter how many frustrations there are, somehow we, I mean human beings, find a way to keep going. We just find a way to keep going. And there's times when I could say this right now. I have been very, very low, very low, and it's not even a case of being miserable. It's a case of thinking, what is the point? What is the point? And yet somehow I got through those occasions. I just think that the world is a complex place, maybe more complex than ever before. You know, we have more people than ever before. Over 8 billion people in the world today. We are inundated with social media, with streaming services, with so many distractions. I have many interests, and that's kind of a good thing because it gives me lots of distractions. But honestly, at times it can be a little bit, okay, just slow down a little bit. Like, you know, I think it's important to have a little bit of time for reflection each day. It's something I should do more actually because it is helpful. And this isn't, I'm not talking about some sort of in depth philosophical meditation. It's just a bit of time out, just 5 minutes, 10 minutes longer if you need it. It could be very, very helpful. And even if you're in a busy 9 to 5 job, at some point, even if it's just before you go to bed, something, just a little bit of, that could be invaluable. So I'm going to leave this off, when we talk about men's mental health, it's not that all guys are alike. There's plenty of men I don't particularly care for, I don't like. So it would be a bit disingenuous to say, oh, we're all the same, or it's not like that. But it's about recognizing that we're not alone in terms of pressure, in terms of just dealing with life. And I think ultimately you have to ask yourself, am I being my best self? It's not about being at the very top of your ambitions, right? That's a process. It's just about being the best self you can be. Um, Being true to yourself, I think, is extremely important, and I am proud of that. For all my frustrations and for all my disappointments, I can truthfully say I've never sold out, never. And I've been in situations where the easy thing would have been to sell out. As an example, I recall being on a little rural country road in Western China, and I'd been brought there by my colleague and her husband. We were going to, I think it was her grandparents' hometown or something. It was a good little trip, actually. It was very interesting. But I remember the conversation in the car turned to Chairman Mao, right? Now, I am a staunch critic of communism. I think it's a totalitarian, brutal system that's cost millions of lives, and Mao was, in my view, a mass killer. But the easiest thing in the world would have been just disagree with her and say, "Yeah, you're absolutely right." But she started like talking about how great a man he was, and I felt a little uncomfortable. But then, it's this cognitive response. I'm thinking, well, I could get into debate about this, but I'm a guest, and what would it achieve? She would presumably be defensive, and she was a decent person. She was very helpful to me as a teacher there, but clearly she was quite taken in by that system. And I'm a guest, so what I done is basically just I think I stayed silent. Then I changed the subject after a few minutes, and it worked. But I never sold out. I never disagreed with her, but nor did I get into not necessary confrontation. So sometimes we have to trust ourselves to make good judgment, because more often than not, we make better judgment than we think. I think in life, if you come across awkward situations, it's highly likely that the other person feels just as awkward. And you're not, it's not that you've been foolish or it's just that life is complex. People are different, and we don't always know the best response. So I think it's extremely important to basically give ourselves a break. Um, I keep updating this channel. I keep putting out videos that I think are relevant, not because I want to rant, but because I do think they're important subjects. And I'm quite proud of the channel. It is growing slowly, but it is growing. There's probably more I could do with it, and I will definitely, that's an area that I can explore. But I've other priorities in life at the exact moment. Uh, I'm going to wrap this one up soon, but if you're feeling a bit lost, and again, I'm not suggesting everyone's experience is exactly the same, but if you're feeling a bit lost, if you're feeling under a lot of pressure, it may be work pressure, it may be financial pressure, it may be with your girlfriend, your wife, it could be anything, your boyfriend, whatever the situation is. Um, what I would say is it doesn't last forever. It may just be a rough patch, because trust me, there's times I have felt this is shite. This is not improving, And it really did. So it may feel like there's things that are not completed, or there's things that aren't, concluded, and yet life has a way of letting them fade out a little bit. Life is not a straight path. I've said this before. Life is not a straight path. It's a zigzag, and that's the way it's meant to be. We do have disappointments. There are things that don't work out. So what? There's other things that will come up. It's not the be all and end all. And that's one of the advantages of the modern world. There's disadvantages, all the negative side effects of social media and all the rest of it. But there's also, in the modern world, a lot more scope for opportunities and for points of interest. And in a sense, it's endless. I'm not saying the opportunities just come, but we have the internet today. There is a lot of positive things about technology. I might sound like I complain about it a lot, but I do recognise there's a lot of positive things with that. I mean, think if you're in some little frontier town in, out west in the 1840s. Think of how restricted your life is. And there's many, many other examples throughout history. Think if you are a 16-year-old lad in a coal mine in the north of England, in Durham or West Yorkshire or Northumberland, circa 1890, right? What's the opportunities in life? So as difficult as contemporary life can be, it's the fact that there's so much going on and there's so many things out there, can be a positive thing. It can be overwhelming, but it can also be positive if we just slow down a little bit and take it one step at a time and say, okay, that's an interesting thing, or that's something I want to do, or okay, that hasn't worked out, I'll try something else. Just keep going. That would be my concluding thought with this video. Just keep going. Never, ever, ever, ever give up on life. Maybe give up on something that isn't working out, but never give up on life. I hope this video has been helpful, and be yourselves. Continue voicing your conviction. Not everyone's going to agree with you. Not everyone agrees with me, but at least know that if you're being your best self, if you're being true to yourself, if you're being true to your convictions, it's really all you can be. And yes, be humble enough to accept that we do learn new things, and sometimes I don't think there's any shame in changing your position if it's from a point of conviction, unless of course it's the wrong viewpoint. Yeah, I won't be arrogant about that one, but yeah, hopefully the point I'm making will be clear here, and thanks for watching.